everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, February 26th, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And this week we have a great episode coming up for you, but before we dive into it, I do, as always, want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, we follow this model where users, that's a weird way to put it, but listeners themselves support the show to offset the cost for listeners who can't support the show, because I want to make sure that Talk Nerdy is always free, always 100% free to download. If you're interested in pledging your support, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy, and you can pledge on a per episode basis. So this week's top patrons, the ones who pledge the most per episode, include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, Riva Keith, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. All right, so let's get into it. This week, I had the opportunity to chat with Dr. Coleen T. Murphy. She is a professor of genomics and molecular biology at Princeton University, and also the director of Princeton's Glenn Foundation for Research on Aging, and the director of the Simons Collaboration on Plasticity in the Aging Brain. So she has a new book out, which is all about aging, titled appropriately, How We Age, the Science of Longevity. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Coleen Murphy. Well, Coleen, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to be talking about your new book, How We Age, the Science of Longevity, and of course, just your general work on aging, on the aging brain, on the kind of molecular biology, or, what's going on inside of an aging body and brain. And I have to tell you, I'm especially excited and curious about this chat because I approach the topic of aging in my work as a psychologist, because I do a lot of older adult intervention, and I work a lot with individuals with cancer, individuals with heart failure and things like that. So I'm super interested in talking about this from a different yet coalescing perspective.
Yeah, very different from looking at worms.
So tell me everything. Maybe we start with your sort of academic path. How did you get to where you are now? What did you study, and what were your sort of research interests?
Right. So as a graduate student, I was very interested in proteins and structure, function, like really getting to understand how proteins work at the single protein level. And I got a really good training in that. And then when I was thinking about what to do as a postdoc, thinking I wanted to go a little broader. And at the same time, my graduate advisor, Jim Spudich, recommended that I listen to a talk by Cynthia Kenyon. And as you know, this was about the same time that she had just discovered that there are mutants in C. elegans that live twice as long, and they're super healthy and youthful. And it was also about the same time that microarrays were being developed, so you could actually look at all the gene transcription going on in a cell all at the same time. So that seemed like the perfect place to go to try to figure out, like, why are these super long-lived animals? How are they able to live so long? And so I went to Cynthia's lab, and that was a great experience. And then at that point, I got interested in, when I started my own lab a couple of years later here at Princeton, asking a different question, which is, how can we study, how can we keep organisms and then eventually humans living their best life for as long as possible, which is a different question from just like living as long as possible. And so at that point, we got really interested in, can we use these little microscopic organisms, C. elegans, to try to understand how can we improve memory and learning with age, and how can we maintain reproductive function with age? So those were the two big questions that my lab started with. So that kind of led to all the research that my lab does. And the book is really a product of, when I got to a point where I could teach a class that I really wanted to teach, looking at all the literature in the field. And so doing that as a class then put me in a position where I could write a book that kind of delved into all these different topics and covered other people's work, I hope in some detail. And so that's what led to the book.
So tell me, you mentioned that you work with this model organism quite a bit called C. elegans, and that's like a teeny tiny little worm, right? So why is it that biologists love to work with this worm, this nematode?
Yeah. Okay. So one thing is that they have a very short lifespan. So they only live 2 to 3 weeks, so average of 21 days. And so what that allows us to do is look at these animals so we can actually see them age over time. So it's enough time that we can see them age. It's not so fast like bacteria where it's like, there and then gone. So we can actually, and if you look at a worm under a microscope, you can see them get kind of fat. They get wrinkly and stop moving around well. And so that allows you to really understand, okay, this animal's aging. But as I mentioned before, what really broke open the field, I think, is not the ability just to look at things as they age, because then you always have this cause and effect problem. You can't tell when you look at something with age, is this the equivalent of looking at, someone's gray hair, something that's not causative, right? And so,
Right. It's
yeah, and
more
so
of a
when
marker. Yeah, it's just age
exactly,
causes that as opposed to that causing you to age faster.
exactly.
Interesting.
So
Okay.
that's a really important principle because for a long time, people, even if they were looking at gene expression or differences in some gene, if they didn't know what the gene did, they wouldn't say much about it. But if they had a name for the gene or the protein that it makes, then they would instantly infer some role for, like if they saw something goes up with age or down with age. But that doesn't really tell you much. And so this mutant called DAF2, which turned out to be the insulin receptor. So just a single mutation in a single gene allowed these animals to live really long and be super healthy that whole time. And so once you know that, then when you start delving into it, you can look all the way down to the cellular level and really understand, well, many things can change with age, but if you only keep a couple of these things not changing, then the whole animal lives in a better way. And so that's really what, C. elegans has allowed us to do all these careful studies and really at the cellular and genetic levels. And usually what we find isn't just, something strange that we find in worms. It's usually, someone will then test it in flies, find the same thing, or in mice. And then a lot of the genes that we're really interested in, the same genes have been found to be, have these single nucleotide polymorphisms in very long-lived people. Okay, so that tells you that these pathways are extremely well evolutionarily conserved, and that allows you to then start really trying to understand, well, okay, what's different? What does this gene do? How does it slow things down? So that's why people love C. elegans, because it really is a extremely powerful research tool.
Oh, I love that. And you mentioned that when that mutant was first discovered, and then the gene or combination of genes that were responsible were found, that it had something to do with an insulin receptor. I mean, it's just like a random side question, but it, obviously that had a much greater impact on the organism's, I guess, like longevity or vitality than you might expect. But is there a relationship between that and insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes? Like, does that seem to be a contributor to aging?
Yeah, so it's all a little bit confusing because we have to think about the directionality. So let me just start with the worms. So before that gene was cloned by Gary Rubkin's lab, when people didn't know what it was, they just had a name for it called DAF2, which is very unhelpful. It just means that the gene has a role in helping the worms decide whether they should go into something called DAOA or not. And actually, I think that actually slowed down the field a little bit in the sense that people are so distracted by this idea that the worms are doing something crazy that other animals don't do by going into this hibernation-like state, that it distracted them from the fact that actually the gene itself is the same in a bunch of different organisms, because they just didn't know. This is like in the early 90s before these genes had been cloned.
Right.
And
Like
so,
we often see the outcome, like we see
yeah,
a function long before we understand the structure behind it.
exactly. So this mutant has other phenotypes as well, so it has other effects. But so anyway, Gary Rupkin's lab then cloned it, and they turned out to be the insulin receptor. And instantly, when you find that out, then you're like, okay, I've heard of insulin. I know
Right.
people have
Diabetes. Right. It's like the first
exactly,
thing you
right?
go to. Yeah.
But the most important to think about is that insulin is this key regulator that connects the nutrients that we take in with the decisions that our cells make. Okay, so that's pretty well conserved. So we can think about it in this case. C. elegans, this insulin receptor, it's not a null, means it's not a total loss of activity. So it basically is dialed down low. And so when the worms have the low activity of this insulin receptor, they're getting the message that they may not have that much food around. Okay. And there's not a lot of food around. Yeah. So then they have to make a decision at the, whole body level. Okay. What should I do? If they're young adults, what they should do is they should slow down reproduction, because it doesn't make sense to lay a bunch of eggs into an environment that doesn't have any food. Right. And so that's a logical thing. So slow down your germline. And then also, if you're going to plan to say those animals are like, okay, well, I can hold out for a couple of days. I'll keep my oocytes nice and healthy, which is finding that my lab later made. So when times are better, when there's more food around, I need to ramp things back up. Okay. But in order to do that successfully, the body that's going to lay these eggs has to be super healthy. Right. So that's how you get the signal that goes from the germline to the rest of the body to slow down aging. Okay. And so that's how it's all connected. And so, diabetes is actually a disease state, and it's not the parallel to this. We can think of it more like if we are in a sort of a low nutrient state, then what are the things that our body will do to slow down things or repair our proteins or things like that. So the parallels are really,
okay.
Yeah, it's not exactly the same as caloric restriction, but for all intents and purposes, that's the parallel logic.
I guess I asked because sometimes what I see, I do a lot of work in sort of the cancer world, and sometimes I'll see claims made that it's almost like that there's a lot of parallels between cancer and aging, and there's a lot of crossover research, but that if you live long enough, you're definitely going to get prostate cancer, or if you live long enough, you might get primary peritoneal or something like that. And so I wasn't sure if there was one of those things, if we were to push longevity into into an extreme, if diabetes will always follow, or if there was a parallel there. But it sounds like there's not. That's kind of a pure pathology. It's really non-normative.
Yeah, so maybe an MD would have a different answer for this that would be worth listening to. I think that more we should think about it like high sugar state. We've also shown that's bad for the worms. It accelerates, and for them, right? If there's a lot of nutrients, you should reproduce as fast as possible. There's no need to preserve the body and slow down aging, because all the progeny come. So I think if you think about the cells having a similar signal, then maybe this inability, like diabetes, is kind of like getting stuck in a state that's unhealthy, right? And so I think that's probably the best analogy. So yeah,
That makes sense.
but
Yeah.
there's a different question, like what you're asking, if we live long enough. It is true. There's some aspect if you live long enough but did nothing to slow down age-related pathologies, then it is true you'd get a lot of these age-related diseases.
Right, you would collect them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But
okay.
Our efforts shouldn't be to just extend lifespan. They should be to slow down all these age-related diseases.
Right. And it's funny because there's obviously a parallel even in psychology to that with end of life work that I do, which is it's funny. It's kind of it's a long thread that I'm drawing, but I don't want to say it's new, but sadly it's kind of new. Focus on, not necessarily life extension medically, but quality, extending the quality of your life, right? And really finding that balance between, are we going to try and do everything medically necessary to extend somebody's life if they're miserable? Or should we be focusing on where is their quality of life and how do we, prioritize that? So it's kind of interesting that at the individual medical, psychological level, there are parallels with the research that you're doing on whole species levels. How do we extend life but with good quality?
Absolutely. And I think when you talk to most people who are actually serious about doing research in the aging field, that's their focus as well. They're very aware of the fact they're not just trying to stretch out life. They're trying to, now in some cases, there's an assumption sometimes that everything that will extend lifespan will make people healthier. And in some cases that's true. And in some cases it's not true. So that's why we have to be that's why I'm interested in the molecular pathways, because distinguishing those pathways that extend lifespan and extend healthy life are interesting and should be distinguished from those that just extend lifespan without any of the benefits.
Yeah. So it's funny. I want to kind of like take a step back because as a person who is scientifically minded, who's worked in science communication for many years as a journalist, but now is not spending, I guess you could say, as like minute to minute. So some of my information is probably a bit outdated. Some of it might just be like folk information. I think the general idea that comes to my mind, and maybe this parallels some of the listeners of the show, is like I think about aging, I think about conversations around telomeres. It seems like that was sort of like all the rage, maybe within the past like decade or so. And so I'm curious how your work, what about that your work kind of focuses on, or is that like not part of the equation, or is it a smaller part of the equation than we used to think it is?
I think that the telomere interest was like probably peaked in the early 2000s.
Mhm. Gosh, 20 years? Oh god. Don't say that out
Not to date anyone.
loud. Yeah.
That's sort of been my impression. Now, C. elegans is maybe a particularly poor organism to look at any of that. So, because the cells in C. elegans don't turn over, they're a really good model for looking at parallels for all tissues that never turn over their cells their whole lifetime.
Oh,
So, are
interesting. So they're
modified.
not constantly dividing, like
Exactly.
okay. All
That's
right.
right. They
That's
develop to adulthood and they have 959 somatic cells. That's it. That's all they'll ever get.
so you can
And
follow
so,
every single cell. That's fascinating.
yeah. And so one thing is amazing. So if you have a worm like these DAF2 worms that are going to live like 6 weeks, they do that not by having more cells, but like keeping the cells that they have healthy, which I think is a good lesson, right? um, but I will say that the telomere, like the cool thing, let me just rephrase it, maybe phrase it in a different way. The cool thing about the aging field is that there are so many interesting discoveries that have been made in the past couple of decades that are parallel to one another, right? And so I would say that for cells that don't divide, things like protein homeostasis and autophagy, things that keep the proteins in the cell healthy and allow them to recycle the materials and keep their lipids healthy, those are all mechanisms that will keep that cell that's never going to turn over, keep that one working. A cell that's going to turn over, there's an intense interest, of course, in stem cells, right? So cells that are going to replace themselves, you need to, instead of keeping those cells healthy, you can get rid of them, right? They can apoptose and die. What's important is keeping the stem cells that are going to, divide and turn into those, differentiate and turn into those cells, keeping those stem cells healthy. And so that's why there's this interest in stem cells. It is true that in order to keep stem cells functioning, you need to keep the telomeres intact, right? So there is that, but it doesn't. I think there's less of a thought that okay, so the enzyme that allows the telomeres to keep getting replaced, that TERT1, I think many years ago, there was this idea of, if you just boosted the levels of that telomerase enzyme, that you'll then have healthier cells. And that seems to not have been totally borne out. So I think there's so many other factors at work. So now there's this idea, you probably might have noticed in the news, there's some idea that you could use what's called Yamanaka factors. So these are these transcription factors that are used in stem cells to differentiate and become new cells. And the idea here is that you could actually generate new cells by putting in more of these transcription factors. In fact, there was a new paper just out this week about that. So there's, new and different techniques and approaches at the molecular level that all might be helpful in helping cells and eventually an organism keep functional longer. So we don't have to rely on just one of these pathways. Telomerase is not the only thing.
Are there examples? I mean, we kind of you touched on it a second ago, but I think it maybe bears digging a little bit deeper. This sort of hypothesis, or maybe even like construct that in the past, researchers were just trying to sort of look at how do we extend life at all costs, but obviously we don't want to do that if it's going to cause like a degradation to quality of life or to functionality. And so most aging researchers now or longevity researchers now are interested in, okay, how do we extend life and it be like healthier life? How do we make it so that the aging process is actually slowed down? Not that you like age rapidly and then you just like live in this decrepit form for a long time. And the question I have for you is sort of like, is there always a trade-off? Like, does the extension of life or does longevity always come with like you have to give something up in order to in order to have more minutes, hours, days, years.
Yeah, so that's a popular idea that hasn't really been borne out by the data. So first we can just start looking at like centenarians. So the people who have lived the longest, and again, this is not my work. This is a study by Nir Bartolai's lab, I believe. So the idea was figure out, do centenarians, for example, do they just live a long time, but they are sick much longer? They've stretched out that unhealthy part of life, or something else. And what they found in this study was, in fact, centenarians actually start getting age-related diseases much later than other people. So they don't stretch out the unhealthy period of life. So kind of what people have been afraid of for a long time just doesn't even seem to be borne out by even the people who experience extreme longevity right now. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. And then your idea of a trade-off. So that's an idea, that came from evolutionary biology. But if we look at the data, and that's usually talked about in terms of like having progeny, so the number of offspring. It is true that if you look at C. elegans, even like you look at these insulin receptor mutants or calorically restricted animals, they have slightly fewer progeny. In DAF2's case, they have 2/3 the number of progeny as wild type worms. Wild type worms have about 300. But they really stretch that out over a longer period of time, and they have healthier oocytes. So they can have progeny much later in life. And so, yeah. And so, if we come back to humans, Tom Pearl's lab many, many years ago showed, actually, this is kind of cool. They looked back at like historical data, and they found that women who lived to be over the age of 95, and they also looked at women who had lived to be over the age of 100, and they looked at when they had their last child. Okay. And so it turns out that the women who would eventually become centenarians, they were able to have kids naturally. And this is way before there was IVF or any sort of artificial reproductive technologies. They had kids after the age of 40. Right. And the women who lived to be 95, they had a kid, more likely to have a kid after the age of 33. So what that tells you is that first it wasn't really, now I don't know, and can't say anything about the number of kids they had, but it doesn't seem like there was a trade-off in fertility in that direction. They were like almost like late fertility was sort of a biomarker of future longevity. And so the question is, what would be the trade-off if you're not talking about fertility? And even when we look at individual C. elegans, we don't see that trade-off. So I guess the idea, like people always say, get the feeling you can't have something for nothing.
I think it's a very human, it's probably cognitive bias that we sort of fall victim to. Yeah, that's interesting. This idea of these, like, I know that this isn't your research, but obviously for the book you had to dig deep, and for teaching in this area you have to dig deep into this. But I think sometimes we also have this maybe misunderstanding, because in the media we love novelty and we love things that are unexpected, and very often you see those stories of like these women who are, it's their 102nd birthday and they're like, what's the secret to a long life? And they're like, drink gin and eat cupcakes,
Exactly.
and you're like, what? And so I'm curious if in the literature you saw anything about like nature versus nurture. Obviously, you're looking at the nature. You're deeply invested in what's going on genetically, and how much of the lifestyle factors are contributing to this. What is that sort of balance?
Okay, so one of my favorite things to do is collect those stories of centenarians, and they're always asked, like, what's the secret to your long life? And invariably, like, and first of all, well, yeah, you're right. It's always like gin or like, or something. So I think the only important lesson we can take there is that if a person's going to be a centenarian, it kind of doesn't matter what they do. It's a sad, it's like a
right. So this is very nature, not very nurture. Yeah.
Exactly. Like they were there's reports of smoking and doing all kinds of things you would not necessarily recommend. And very few of them, by the way, have been like super athletes. Like I know it's actually notable when you find someone who's a centenarian who was also athletic. So it's not like, so I just think basically we can learn no lifestyle lessons from centenarians because they're just like genetic superheroes.
Yeah, it's sort of like sadly the opposite of like if a little kid, a really, really young child develops, a childhood cancer, like they didn't do anything.
Exactly.
That wasn't because of carcinogens. It's because their cells were already leaning in that direction.
Exactly. Now, there is a funny thing if you look at, since most of these centenarians are women,
Oh, interesting.
Almost
Well,
all of them
not
have
that interesting, actually. I was like, oh, and then I was like, man, okay, that doesn't surprise me.
but all of them are like a bunch of them are like avoid men. That's
Mhm.
their secret. So like
Never get married. Yeah.
exactly. I mean, there's some interesting sociological say like the people who are the longest lived are women who are not married, women who didn't never married. Um, there are social parts of it that like people who take care of other people actually take on the stress of other people. It appears to like that is actually, and actually we brought up telomeres, and there's some work by Liz Blackburn's lab that has shown that there's stress that affects telomere length. And so I think there are cases where, the stress of being a caretaker does shorten people's lifespan. So there's,
That's
and
interesting. Yeah.
social networks actually help protect that. So women have sort of like a dual role. They take care of other people often, but they also like are more likely to have a stronger social network than men. And so and that's not that might have like a biological ultimate effect that we can study, but right now, like when I study C. elegans, I can't really study that part of it.
Yeah, but it is interesting that you see parallels across the board. Like we know that women who were never married are the happiest group as well, and that like married men are happier than unmarried men, but married women are less happy. And yeah. It's really interesting to look at all of the data there. Okay, so we do know that there are probably some lifestyle factor. I mean, obviously, nothing is 100%. Well, very few things in this world are 100% biological. Very few things are 100%. I don't even like the concept of nature, quote, versus nurture, right? Because they sort of
It's all
exacerbate one
intertwined, right?
another.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can't always tease them apart, but I guess that is important for research and really looking at the variance. But you're really focused on the nature side. Do you do any nurture type? I know it's like probably the window is different with C. elegans, but do you do any lifestyle research? Lifestyle is
Actually, what's
probably a
kind of
strong word.
yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, we like to think about that stuff because we like to figure out what can we extrapolate and what can we not. And so for a long time, I like to say, there were these questions about like the grandmother hypothesis, right? This idea that women live longer because they contribute to the health and success of their grand progeny. And I don't think that that's wrong. But we do observe, for example, in C. elegans, that they also have a very long post-reproductive lifespan. And so for a long time, I like to joke that, they don't even take care of their young. And then it turns out, and we did all this work on how can you figure out like what post-reproductive lifespan correlates with, and we made some interesting findings there. But more recently, I've started to change my tune even about C. elegans because, if you are C. elegans, how would you care for your young? You would protect them. And how can you protect them? You could protect them from, for example, if you encounter a pathogen. So worms swim around, they live mostly on rotting apples. That's where they find all the bacteria that they eat.
Oh, okay.
And so, so that they're really in
Nice.
rotting fruit. Yeah. So,
Okay.
and in fact, actually, a fun field trip last fall, we went to an apple orchard and collected a bunch of apples and got all the worms off of them and the bacteria. But so if you're a worm and you're swimming around and you're like, times are good, there's lots of bacteria on this apple, and you eat them. But if you encounter a pathogen that smells just like your food, what do? And so it turns out the mothers who eat these pathogenic bacteria, they get a signal from the bacteria itself. The bacteria make all kinds of signals inside them for their own metabolic purposes. And it turns out that when worms eat those bacteria, they eat the small RNAs that the bacteria making for their own good. And they use that as information, not only for themselves, but they actually pass on a signal to avoid that bacteria to 4 generations of their progeny. And so that's so cool. So they do take care of their young that way. And they also, secondly, they secrete this viral-like particle that contains that same message. So if they're like cousins, eat some of that viral-like particle, they'll also know to avoid that pathogen in the future.
Yeah, so it's not just about direct lineage, it's like a kinship thing as well. Just like
Yeah,
anybody in my tribe, anybody nearby.
exactly.
I like that. That's I mean, it doesn't surprise it's cool, but it's like you're like, okay, yeah, it makes sense. You know,
Yeah.
it also, it makes me wonder too, and I don't know how you could possibly research this with C. elegans, but looking at the literature, I'm asking for my own selfish purposes. Like I just turned 40 and I am child free, by choice. Also now I'm forced in that direction, but also by choice. And I talk about this a lot with my friends who either have multiple kids, had kids young, had kids older, or I have quite a few friends now who don't have children at all. And how just giving birth, but then also raising a child, giving those resources over affects the aging process.
Mm.
And obviously C. elegans, because I think a lot of the research, the basic biological research is about like these organisms could have, could produce offspring, or they could produce it much later in life, like you were mentioning before. But a worm is not going to be like, I could, but I choose not to. And so I'm curious if you've seen any literature on that like women who choose not to have children, if that affects the aging process at all.
Okay, so a bunch of things I want to say. So first, I will say that C. elegans actually, there's a very cool assay. It's called the sprinting assay. So this experiment, if you put down a hermaphrodite, which these all are because they make both sperm and oocyte, if they detect a male, they will run away. So they do choose.
I love that.
And they actually do that until all of their own self-progeny are done. And when they run out of their own self-sperm, then they're like, okay. And then
I guess, yeah, I'll take the second best. That's so funny.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, so they actually do this. So that's one of my favorite stories about C. elegans. Look, there's all kinds of things with women's aging that I think we're just now starting to understand better. There's finally starting to be more and more good research in this area.
Right, because like more women are doing research about women. That's
exactly. And there's more funding in those areas too, finally. So that's really good. Okay, so there's a couple different things. So there's having kids, and then there's the sort of inevitable relationship with just like menopause, postmenopausal aging. And one of the scariest things is that menopause actually, like the time of like this is if you use one of these what's called a aging clock. So Steve Horvath developed this way of looking at DNA methylation. And if you use this clock, so he and Morgan Levine found that if you look at women who have gone into menopause, either from surgery or naturally, they actually see this increase in the rate of aging at that point. Okay. So that's a little bit kind of like it matches our expectation, but a little bit scary. And that's going to happen whether or not someone has kids, right? So
have they looked at whether hormone replacement
actually this study did. So in that study they did and actually showed that it slowed it down by their clock metric.
Interesting.
So so that was pretty interesting. So there's a lot of lessons in there. It is true these studies of like more like demography, like who lives the longest, or it seems that having 2 kids is like the optimal number of kids. If you're going to have like anything more than that, the lifespan of the women went down. So
But what about not having kids at all? Has anybody looked into that?
Somebody probably has. I probably even saw a paper on that. I think that, but I would probably have to come back to that. I do think that women mostly it comes out in terms of women who had never been married live the longest.
Yeah. And I think it's so funny because so much of our literature, you think that it's agnostic to the patriarchy, or you would think that, and of course we don't think that, but some people might think that like, well, but science is science. And it's like, no, science is done by people. And we have all of these zeitgeists and these normative things. And it makes me think that like women who choose not to have children are often like, it's like they weren't considered as a group in the past. It was like, oh, you didn't have kids, there must be something wrong with you. And so that would be sort of the idea, like, well, these women were infertile and so they're in this group for our research. But this idea that like,
have to look back, like, there's probably something in some paper that I'm overlooking. So I don't want to diss the authors who actually did the hard work on that. But I'm just not off the top of my head.
But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if it's just not a common area, or it's not a common group within the literature.
Historically, right?
Yeah, right. Because there's like an assumption that there's a reason behind it that's biological, or that's
and maybe now that will be more studied as more and more people choose not to have kids.
Yeah, I hope so. I feel like I feel like there's a working hypothesis here. I definitely feel like when I meet women who have had, or my friends who are dealing with raising littles, they're looking rough. It's hard to know if it's an aging thing or if it's just like, oh, you need to sleep more. Yeah, exactly.
And we know
Uh,
that sleep is very important. So it's
yeah.
not like, it may not be direct. Like I think that's a real question with to set up the scientific question. Like, is it having kids, or is it like being so tired and sleep deprived for such a large chunk of your life that is
Hmm.
having an effect on aging? I think that would be a good question to answer, since we know sleep is super important.
Yeah, and or a lack of the amount of time and effort and energy you can put into like self-care, which sleep is a huge component of that, but so is just like rest and engaging in like, I don't know, leisure or engaging in activities that are mentally challenging. Or I can imagine that a lot of these things might contribute. But again, these are all lifestyle factors that, as you sort of mentioned, the variance there feels like it might be lower than we'd hope. Yeah. So a lot of what we're talking about is sort of luck of the draw. Like, what kind of genes did I get from my parents? Do you find that longer lived people tend to produce longer lived people? I mean, when we talk about something that's at the molecular level, at the cell
Yeah.
or the genetic
Okay.
level,
So
you would assume that.
yeah. So definitely for the people who are at the end, these people with extreme longevity, um, one of the best predictors, it's kind of a useless piece of information by the time you find it out, but one of the best predictors is that you're gonna live long is if you have a long lived sibling. Okay.
Right.
So
Yeah. That's
um,
funny.
but parents' lifespan, things like that are very, now the amount of uh, longevity that is genetically determined, right? So that's been studied by many groups, and it's interesting because there's been sort of like a couple different schools of thought. One, of course, is that there's this huge genetic component to everything, and for the people who have these specific variants, like there's a couple of variants, things in ApoE and FOXO3A. So those genes are so strong that these longevity alleles that it kind of doesn't matter what else is in the background. But then for everybody else, and I kind of want to make sure that we distinguish the centenarians from everybody else, because for everybody else, all these lifestyle factors are super important, right? What we eat, how much exercise we get, how much sleep. So unless you know that you have the variant that's going to destine you to be a centenarian, you probably should pay a lot of attention to your health.
I see. So like I may not live to be like 115 years old, but how I treat my body and what I do now could make a huge difference between if I die at 80 or 90 or 70 or 80 or,
Yeah, I
something
think
like
that's
that.
true. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's the problem with this is it's all the boring stuff that we already knew, right? Like, and kind of the no fun stuff, like,
Eat vegetables.
yeah, yeah, all those things. And so I think sometimes when people, um, you know, listen to these things or go and read my book or something, they're looking for like that one magic bullet that's going to like make sure that they don't have to do anything else. And like
Mhm.
I said, unless they're a genetic variant, it all adds up, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's no
Sadly.
fun. Yeah.
What about, but when we talk about the genetic variants, these kind of like super agers, or that's
Mhm.
funny because that almost sounds like the opposite of what I'm trying to say. Not somebody
No,
who ages
they're
really
actually
fast.
literally called that. Yeah, they're literally called that.
Oh,
Super
okay,
agent.
good. So somebody who
Yeah.
ages really well or ages for a long
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
So when you look at like a model organism like C. elegans, do the really kind of protected ones, like the super ager C. elegans, tend
Mhm.
to give birth? Do they give birth? How do they
Yeah, they
tend to
lay eggs.
procreate? Okay, yeah. So do they tend to have offspring that are also super agers?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's completely genetically true. So we know those mutants. Now, what's cool to ask though is within a population, say you have 100 animals that are genetically identical, okay? They don't all drop dead on the same day. They don't even like
Right.
age at the same rate. And so what's really cool to look at is, and this is work that my lab did a couple of years ago in collaboration with a group in Korea. We, if you take say 100 worms and you every day pick those worms off a plate and you film them like crawling around on a plate, you can track how fast they move, and you can even track, what we discovered was if you track their maximum speed, so this is like the moment when they start sprinting, that goes down with age. And when they're middle aged, you can predict which ones are going to live long by separating them into the ones that have a really fast maximum velocity versus the ones that have a slower maximum velocity. So even within that like genetically identical isogenic population, there's stochasticity, but it's predictable based on something we can see in middle age.
And I love this because it completely pulls the rug out of that. Do you remember that ridiculous thing that Trump said several years ago when he was like, I don't like to work out too much because there's only like so much energy somebody has in their life and I don't want to use it. And it's like, no, it's the opposite of that, my friend.
Yeah, no, he said that thing about like number of heartbeats or something, which is weird. Yeah.
It's super weird. But what you're saying is basically that those that are kind of like have more energy or healthier or kind of like go in a little bit harder, but not to an extreme, just that they're showing this capability of metabolic strength. They're showing that they can like show off. They can still go.
So
that's a good thing. Yes, that biomarker is predictive of a longer life, not the other way around. They're not burning themselves out of energy faster.
Yeah, exactly. And that's been shown for, I think, a lot of it. That's a big part of the field is trying to figure out what are other proxies that we can measure in midlife that would tell us how healthy someone is going to be for many years. And so is that a blood thing? Is that like a, experimental test we need to do on people? So there are people in the field trying to figure that out. And I think that's going to be really helpful for us, because if you could figure out people who are going to live shorter, then maybe you'd want to help them change
do more
their lifestyle choices. Exactly.
Yeah. Or like, it's just kind of like, what do you call it? Like, gosh, why am I blanking on the word? But just like, protective medicine, like doing things early preventive, thank you, as opposed to, treating something after it already happens.
Exactly. Which, I have to say for American medicine, we're very good at treating things after they're a problem, but not really preventing them. So we need to get better at that.
But I guess I would also ask how often in that kind of research, whether we're talking about something like at the molecular level that almost feels like it doesn't translate, even though it does translate, it's like you've got to go many, many steps to translating it to, let's say, biomedical research on human beings. How many times, though, are we doing these deep dives and then kind of the outcome is, well, yeah, obviously, it's like exercise and eat well.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, that's true. But the reason that we're studying it isn't to like necessarily stop at telling people what they should eat or how much exercise they should get. The real basis of a lot of the research that's going on in all these different labs is to understand, well, what does exercise do? What does eating less do? So that you can understand at the molecular level what they do. And then so imagine somebody who is like it's okay to tell people not to eat so much or to exercise if they're already healthy and able to do that stuff. But say someone is like in a wheelchair and can't necessarily exercise as much as they'd like or something like that. Wouldn't it be helpful if you could understand what that molecular target of, caloric restriction or exercise is, and then develop a drug to give to people so that it can actually kind of like jumpstart that in them? Or someone who is suffering early from some sort of age-related disease. Could we give them a drug that mimics, those are called like caloric restriction mimetics. So if you give them a drug that would mimic the state of caloric restriction, then could they be healthier? And that's actually the idea behind a lot of these, what we're glad to see now, some of these clinical trials of things like metformin and rapamycin, right? So that maybe we can figure out how to help people be healthier.
Interesting. I'm curious, as a scientist and as somebody who, is speaking in the media and probably has at least some amount of your finger on the pulse of sort of the public communication component of aging and wellness research, or I should say wellness, not research, but wellness.
The whole lifestyle stuff.
Yeah. How often are you like screaming into the void, rolling your eyes at like the amount of pseudoscience and the amount of sort of like self-help stuff that is, moving into bullshit territory that's like worrisome for you?
Yeah, it's constant. Right. There's like a never-ending delusion. Unfortunately, because I did a lot of research for the book, now Google thinks I'm interested in every one of these ridiculous things. And so I get constant notices. The problem is, and so one of the messages, part of the reason that I really want the field to understand what all the molecular targets of these interventions might be is so that eventually we'll have good FDA clinical trials of things so that someone can't just sell you something like through Facebook that actually is like junk. great and that's one of the good efforts in the field is to like ask, okay, so there's something called the TAME trial. So this is, again, this is Nir Barzilai's efforts to try to get metformin classified as a longevity treatment drug because by doing a clinical trial that really looks at what does it do to people, how does it, what are the effects, how long do you have to take it, and are there in the blood, like can you see diagnostic, blood biomarkers that are helpful? Because right now we're in the state where there's things like nutraceuticals, which people can just sell you stuff and say that they have some great effect. And how would you know the difference?
Because they're quote vitamins, so they're not even regulated by the FDA. It's like a whole thing.
Exactly. And so that's a little frustrating. And then the idea that the other thing that particularly vexing to me is the idea that we've figured everything out already. And so people should just, go on some diet or something. And it just
That's that worries me a lot. Like, yes, all the woo-woo stuff that people try to sell is scary, but I think even more worrisome are these like lifestyle influencers that are just like, you need to just fast all the time. And I can see them making that leap, even listening to this interview with the conversations about like caloric restriction or about like, keeping your sugar low and all of those things and the links between that they would be like, okay, so I should just like not eat. And it's like, no.
Yeah. And that's worrisome to me. First of all, there's people who really enjoy doing that. And in my experience, it's not entirely men, but it's almost all men. And they will definitely tell you that they're doing it. And there's lots of good scientific backing for that from model systems research. So I'm not saying that they're wrong. But when it comes to humans, I think when we're talking about quality of life, eating is part of quality of life. And I don't think it's particularly useful to like say that everybody should be caloric restricting themselves all the time because it's really not that great.
And there's also a level, like you can go too far and it's really detrimental to your health. And of course, we see that more often in women, sadly. So it's like, you got to be careful there. Yeah.
One of the things I talk about in the book, a lot of these guys too are promoting this. They have not been bombarded with messages since they were preteens about how skinny they should be. And so I think they're kind of missing that and the idea of like eating disorders and things like that. So anyway, that's completely fraught and also underrepresents the science that's been done in the field to really understand the molecular mechanisms of all this stuff that I'm really interested in.
Yeah. There are other ways to have these conversations that aren't so. I think that's, again, it comes down to this like very deep cognitive bias that I don't want to blame on nature. I think there's a heavy nurture component that we reinforce these cognitive biases, especially through our politics and through the way that we structure our education. That's like this very black and white thinking approach to life, right? Like, oh, well, I heard this thing, so it's always definitely going to be this way. And it's like, no, there's so much gray, there's so much nuance, and there's almost never a simple answer or a quick fix. That's why we're digging deep into that's why this conversation has been going on for 46 minutes, right? We couldn't just have this conversation in 2 minutes and be like, okay, call it a day. It just, sadly, science doesn't work that way. And I think that's why in the sciences, we often are frustrated by self-help or pseudoscience industries because they get prey on that.
It's particularly weird because then you have these individuals who are like taking the drug that they developed, or it's a weird, like doesn't happen, I think, in other fields where somebody's actually like, trying to do some experiment on themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's kind of weird. I do think in some cases, like if you are ill from some disease or especially metabolic disorder, I think there are cases where things like intermittent fasting and caloric restriction could be really helpful. And I think there was a study that just came out this week showing that all these blood biomarkers get better. So I think there are cases where like you might want to do that. Yeah. So
there are also cases where like going into ketosis is healthy, right? But like for a lot of people who are like, no, I want to just eat keto all the time and have all these ketones in my blood. It's like, okay, balance.
There's a huge psychological component to all of this. It's not particularly great. So about like fasting and stuff. So I think that gets brushed under the rug because as I've been saying recently, like if you give a C. elegans who's been fasting a choice, they will pick the food, right? So like, it's not like
Right.
they
There
want
is,
to do it
yeah.
either.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there is something there that's deeply programmed in us. I hate using that word, but yes, we are still alive. We are biological organisms who have a life drive, right? Who are going to do the things that we, even without thinking about it, that are protective. Interesting. Okay, so I've got to ask because we're like running low on time. Is there anything we've talked about a lot of stuff, but I didn't really follow the structure of the book. I meandered a lot. So is there anything like big surprises or big takeaways that we didn't tap into that you'd be like, no, we can't end before your listeners hear this?
Oh my God, now I have to think about all the stuff in my book. Oh, okay. So there's um, the reason, again, this is not really a self-help book, but I do think that understanding what I want readers to understand is like if we can really deeply understand the molecular mechanisms that play into aging and longevity, then, like I said, it's actually kind of really exciting time. There are a bunch of, and I don't have any connection with any of these companies or biotechs, but there's a whole bunch of biotechs that have taken off in past couple years that are looking at many of these different pathways that have been discovered and developing drugs that could help people. And I'm excited about this because I don't think it's selfish to think about, like I used to be worried, oh, well, we're going to make a drug and only rich people will get it. And that'll, increase the inequalities that we already see. But what I am hoping is that because there's so many of these different approaches that are happening, that maybe some of them will be very accessible, and also that some of them may help not just people who are elderly, but also people who have other problems, even in midlife. And I think that's something like, for example, I saw an interesting talk about senolytics being used to treat people who are survivors of childhood cancers. So these are people like in their middle life or having, and that's exciting, right? Because then you're like helping a broader group of people than just like people who are, concerned about living forever. So
Yeah, and
I
also
think
like I said earlier, there's so much crossover sort of between aging research and cancer biology research that I could see that sort of unintended there would be these discoveries that then somebody else who studies something else is like, "Holy wow, I got to dig into this," and then something else comes out of it.
that's right. So I think there's a lot of good effects that we usually think about all the terrible things that will happen. But in fact, I think there's going to be a lot of good things that will happen, but we're on the cusp of that. They haven't come yet. So anyone who's telling you they have all the secrets and they know the secret to long life and all that probably doesn't really. But we're actually getting to a point where there's going to be something that can be taken for a lot of these. And I just want to say one last thing, which is kind of crazy about when we're talking about food and stuff, is that these all these things about semaglutides, and they seem to be like kind of miracle drugs that I think are going to be like kind of longevity drugs in the sense that they're going to help people who would have otherwise died early of cardiovascular disease. They're going to extend their lifespans. And so I think it's kind of interesting that we've already have just like a thing that's kind of like even mainstream at this point, that is kind of right in front of us that we might consider it to be a longevity drug in some ways.
Yeah, that is interesting, this idea of sort of like what's already available, and are we using it the right way, or can we think about it in a new way? I love that. Well, okay, so I haven't done this in a while because I've forgotten, so apologies to my listeners, but I historically always asked my guests the same two questions, these closing questions at the end of the show. They're sort of really big picture, but you can answer them however you'd like. So basically, I want you to think about whatever context feels relevant to you right now. So I know you're in the lab, literally, like you've locked yourself off to be able to talk to me. So this could be with your work, but it could be personal, it could be family, it could be community, even global or cosmic. The first question, which is the bummer question, so we get it out of the way, is when you think about the future, what is the thing that's keeping you up the most at night, the thing that is most concerning for you, maybe even you're bordering on like pessimism or cynicism. And then on the flip side of that, to end on a more positive note, where are you finding your hope, your optimism? Like, what are you really looking forward to?
Well, for the second question, I think I just answered that with all the, like, we're on the brink of discovering all these things. I will say for the first question, actually, the thing that struck me while writing this book was even if we could solve all these problems in the longevity field and maybe, miraculous like medical breakthroughs well, it's not going to matter if, our earth has heated up so much that we can't live on it anymore.
Right.
I think that we have to go hand in hand if we're going to try to help people live as long as possible. We need to do a better job addressing climate change problems. And so that's probably the thing that I don't work on, but like I think that it is really important to keep in mind when we're talking about long life.
Yeah, I mean, a great way to put it. It's all synergetic, right? Like you're doing all this research on how to live longer, but what's the point if,
Yes,
yeah, we don't
there's
have a
nothing
place to
for.
live? Yeah, no. Well said. Well, everybody, the book is How We Age, The Science of Longevity by Dr. Coleen T. Murphy. Coleen, thank you so much for being here, for enlightening us. It's been a really interesting and exciting chat. So thanks for sharing your time with us.
Well, you're welcome, and thanks for having me.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.